Marcus has exhorted me to be brief and avoid corroborative detail, to add artistic verisimilitude to a bald and otherwise unconvincing narrative. Now, for those of you who did science for A-level, that means brevity is the soul of wit. Okay? Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Tim. I remember him vividly. In fact, he is encapsulated in my memoirs, which I hope you have all bought. And I wrote the following line: I recall one herpetologist who played a deadly game of rugby for the first team and then enjoyed nothing more than to retire to the snake pit to tend his lethal serpents for relaxation. Well, those of you who were there maybe in the time of Armstrong. Anyone here was with Armstrong? You were. The tradition continues. Rockjaw, as he was called. When I went back to give out the prize-giving speech a few years ago, Rockjaw was hurtling down the road with a snake skin over his shoulder on his motorbike to go and get some spitting cobra or other that was about to spit in the eye of some unfortunate person. Now, at Falcon, the only snake bites we ever had were from a funny little critter called Bibron's burrowing adder. Now, this little critter has fangs that can work their way backwards. So boys would do the right thing and they'd pick it up by the neck at the back, and the fang would come round, zap in the thumb. And it was damn painful. And those were the only snake bites that I can recall. Even you avoided anything, which is absolutely remarkable. Tim says he's not going to talk about himself. Well, you know, we've got here first rugby player, and I heard that mention of that chap being flattened. Well, he was the precursor of Jomo Lomo. He was a vicious wing down the left-hand side, if I remember rightly, and was an amazing, strong rugby player. And I think you played for a couple of years. And very unassumingly, he said he did all sorts of other sports and so on, and he was really an outstanding athlete. Then, when he left Falcon at the end of '65, I don't think you finished any courses particularly that you can remember, he went into the British Army, and he's been all over the place, travelling widely, and ending up as a lieutenant colonel. Unbelievable. So there we go. So, you know, Tim goes back a long way in the early days, because those were glorious years, those early years. As you probably know, every year a handful of us go on what we call a peregrination, and we go along the Orange River and all over the show, traveling. I put my foot down the year before last on the Orange River. They damn near tried to kill me. I had terrible bronchitis, I was coughing and spluttering, and I told Roger Thomas, I am going to have a shower, a proper loo, and a roof over my head, otherwise I'm not coming. And they acceded to my request last time. But it's just, but amazingly, you know, it's astonishing that a group of boys from those early 1960 years are still going on what we call peregrinations. And that's absolutely, absolutely marvelous. Well, all my golden words are spent, so over to Tim.
Well, Peter. Well, thank you very much for that unexpected and I'm sure malicious build-up. But it's certainly great to be here in Cape Town, despite the drought, at this great event. And I think it's been magnificently organised, name tags for everyone, food, etc. And I think we all know Marcus a big debt of gratitude for continually organising and putting on these events every year. So thank you very much indeed, Marcus. I hope I haven't been out of place on that. But as he said, I hadn't planned on being part of the formal proceedings this evening, but I did make a mistake and contact him to see if I can combine this with a trip to Namibia. And when he gave me the date and I said I could attend, he very quickly tagged me to speak. So if any of you here find yourselves in similar circumstances with Mr. Gordon, just beware. I'm sure tactics will come into play. But at least I now have the opportunity to look back at nearly 60 years since I first enjoyed the delights of Falcon. I arrived in 1960, and what a soundtrack 60 had. I think Neil Sedaka was on top of the pops, or topping the things with "Oh Carol." On the cinema was a great ionic western with James Coburn, Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, and any ideas what it might be? Iconic? The Magnificent Seven. Brilliant. In sport, a certain Cassius Clay won his first professional fight.
No, amateur.
No, professional fight. He also won his Olympic medals then, but first professional fight. And on a more serious note, the first American military advisors arrived in Vietnam. And of course, closer to home here was a sad shooting at Sharpeville. So in another 50 or 60 years, I wonder how the present crop of Falcon pupils are going to look back on this era. Well, something pretty significant happened about 12 months ago. And I don't mean the inauguration of the 45th President of the United States, one Donald J. Trump. But in his foreword to the 216 school magazine, Lt.Col wrote of his excitement that next year we will be guiding the boys in their approach and manners around young ladies. Well, I thought, great idea. And I imagined he was going to be taking a nice new member of staff on to teach the boys some manners. But oh no, last year, an intake of 12 girls arrived. Afraid so. Not only that, but Reg hopes the number's going to increase. And I gather you've just been there, John, and I gather it's up to 30 now, or so.
Spoil the whole thing. Ruin the party.
No, well, I'm sorry, you didn't tell me what to speak about, so I picked this as my subject. Okay. Now, I understand there was the occasional girl there in the 70s. But yes, it took a war to make it happen. So this really is a change of tradition and the start of a new era at Falcon. I gather the subject's been hotly debated over the last 6 years or so, with many old boys strongly opposed to the move. And to be fair, I guess if I'd been asked a few years ago, I too would have been pretty strongly opposed to it. To me, life at Falcon was very definitely conducted in an all-male environment, with all-male friends, all-male values and attitudes, and all-male camaraderie. So before I go on to say how I perhaps view the matter now, allow me to reminisce a little about how I saw life at Falcon, whilst in the tender care of founders, of course, and Rumble, dear old Monty Woolley. Obviously our parents sent us there to be well educated, but my memories are of one big boys' club, with books, homework and learning really coming very much second fiddle. In attending classes, I seemed to be marking time until I could disappear to the sports fields, or to go for a run around the mine dumps, probably for a smoke, or to go into the shut-in to catch some snakes. Staff appeared to have a pretty unspoken policy of letting boys be boys, letting them be free spirits, and living life for the full. And looking at the age of people here, someone might well have been here in 1962 and been a member of the Model Aeroplane Club. It was the club, I gather, that was set up, encouraged by the headmaster, by a sixth form pupil. It is you, is it, Mark? And it ran undetected for most of 662. Basically, it was set up, and seeing us here, I think, to occupy his spare time and keep him out of mischief. But in fact, was a sophisticated smoking club, located in one of the remote outbuildings. I gather that to get rid of the smoke, they dispensed the modelling glue with flick guns. You might remember those pump-action predecessors of aerosols. And they very cunningly, or maybe not uncunningly, used juniors as your lookouts, I gather.
Club members up in the loft.
No, yeah, okay. Anyway, the rules seem to be to allow the boys their freedom and just administer, of course, a good dorking to anyone caught breaking the most basic rules. Of course, I feel none of this is to suggest the school didn't actively shape our character. Considerable effort went into building a strong ethics of teamwork amongst us all. I think the whole dorm system of living and sleeping with your contemporaries, looking after your own space and cleaning up your own mess, helped us all to help, support, trust and live with each other. As I'm sure you remember, there was also a big emphasis, or strong emphasis, on sport and inter-house competitions. And some of you will probably have a slightly different recollection, but I seem to remember that in my days there, Founders were certainly the most successful house. I was reminded of this importance in sport when I visited in '98. And I think it was Twik van Veek recognised me in the staff common room. And he said, "Oh, Hawkins, I remember you. You used to play wing. I can remember Monty winding you up before the match with Milton by telling you that the word in the Milton camp is that the Falcon winger Hawkins has got a yellow streak all the way down his back." Well, I've no idea whether it worked, but unfortunately he made no mention of my academic achievements. Anyway, all this was character building, great fun, and I think excellent preparation for building and understanding solid relationships later in life. Although for me, probably relationships were very largely male-based. That said, some of us did occasionally encounter girls, and I know Marcus would have done, he was on these journeys as well, when our term coincided with that of St. Peter's. Are there any St. Peter's girls here? Yes. Oh, excellent, we must talk of, excellent. You're a few years later, but excellent. When they would join those of us who lived in Northern Rhodesia for a train journey up north. As you may probably know, it was a pretty long, slow, boring, potentially boring 24-hour train journey. But one for us Falcon lads without any adult supervision. I guess our seniors were meant to look after us and guide us. But I seem to remember with the likes of a guy called Terry Bates, who lost an eye in a pellet gun incident and used to go around scaring everyone by replacing his glass eye with a grape. Mature leadership was notably absent. So running along the carriage roofs for dares and climbing through or down through the girls' compartment windows to avoid the nuns might have been great fun, but probably not the most sensible of escapades. And I wonder who would have been responsible for risk assessment these days. Typical but less risky was jumping off the train at Vic Falls and going to that lovely old Vic Falls hotel for a few beers and waiting to see who would be the first to make a break for Livingston to catch the train before it continued further north. Although this actually trained me quite well for later in life, and I can remember my regimental sergeant major tested me in a similar manner in a seedy Belfast bar as he watched the young officers that had assembled there and was plying with drink and waiting to see who would be the first to break cover and make a dash for the port on our boat returning to England. Anyway, I guess after life at Falcon, I was destined for life in a largely male environment. I really wanted to be a big game vet, but as you can probably pick up, my lack of academic success rather ruled this out. So within 6 months of leaving, I joined the British Army. Interestingly, at the regular commissions board I attended in '65, some 8 of the 20-odd candidates at the board had all come from northern or southern Rhodesia, perhaps the mark of the time. Ultimately, I spent 30 years in the army, traveling the world, and my last post appointment was Defence Attaché in West Africa, looking after 5 countries, before I then returned to Africa to work for De Beers in Angola, as we've discussed there. So, having gone from one all-male environment to another, it took me a further 18 years before I overcame my shyness of girls and plucked up the courage and asked one to marry me. I met my lovely and, I have to say, long-suffering, and sometimes I say very long-suffering wife, Barbara, in Oman at the end of the Dhofar War. So you can see once again, it took a war to break the habit of a lifetime. And that probably brings you back to the question of girls at Falcon. Looking back, I now wonder what their effect might have had on my development at the school. And since I had no sister to interact with, I suspect it would have been quite significant. I think, in all honesty, I'd have probably learned to listen more readily to others, be more forgiving, probably a bit gentler, less macho, and not always tried quite so hard to prove myself. I think I'd probably also have been prepared to treat, or more prepared to treat girls as equals, and not felt so shy and awkward in their company, which is something I've often reflected on. And I think finally their presence might even have enabled me to mature a bit earlier in life. I only realised a lot of this when I was commanding officer of Birmingham University Officers Training Corps, where we had 400 odd undergraduates, of which 100 are very competent, able, intelligent young ladies. And it was amazing how markedly more mature and focused than they were of the men of the same age. And the girls' early maturity was something I'd not appreciated until then, despite my experiences on those long, but perhaps not quite so boring train journeys. So for those of you who still feel that girls at Falcon are not good news, I ask you to dwell a little on both, not just the obstacles, but the benefits that our successors might get from them. And try to remember on how your time at Falcon benefited you, or perhaps in some ways failed you. You may come to the conclusion that the Falcon spirit of adventure, camaraderie, and living life to the full will be enhanced, rather than diminished by the presence of the fairer sex. Now that's all you'll be pleased to hear that I've got to say on that. But I think I'd just like to propose a toast, if I might, to the college. And I've written a little ditty for that, and you might recognise some of it. Amongst the copies on an old mine site, a Falcon made its plan, forging a treasure in the heart of Matabele land. Eager boys laid its foundation under skies of jacaranda blue. But with inspired determination, the college slowly grew. Where gold was once found, we grew rich in education, yet treasuring our independence, 40 miles from civilization. Half a century later, the first girls entered last year to gain for themselves the character that comes from being there. So here's to the future. May it prosper forevermore, enriching the lives of all who walk through the door. What a fabulous history the college has so far. So please raise your glasses and let's reach for the stars. The college. Anyway.
Thank you.
All right. Probably not what you wanted, but there we are.
Well done. Absolutely. Great. Thanks.